In 1968, Dwight D. Eisenhower's former Vice President, Richard Nixon, from California, ascended to the presidency, defeating the incumbent Vice President, Hubert Humphrey. Elections are always driven by a combination of candidate ideas and savvy and election circumstances. When it is more the former, one may say the candidate and party won the election. When it is more the latter, it's more about who didn't win the election. The 1968 presidential election was the latter. This was an election lost by the Democratic Party far more than it was won by the Republicans and Richard Nixon. Welcome to this History Changes podcast, Breaking the Social Contract. I am Dr. Philip W. Travis, and on this episode, we will explore the role of Richard Nixon in the historical decline in public trust in government that eventually culminated in the Trump era. "1968 was a disaster for the United States and politically for the Democratic Party. The year began with the shocking Tet Offensive in Vietnam on January 31st, when the North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong ally in the South launched a massive countrywide offensive across South Vietnam. Ultimately, and with a bit of irony, the Tet Offensive was put down impressively by the United States and their South Vietnamese ally. From a military standpoint, it marked the conflict transitioning away from the largely guerrilla-led conflict to a more conventional North Vietnamese-directed war, a fact that was necessitated by the near total destruction suffered by the Viet Cong during the offensive. However, Americans were shocked. The Johnson administration, along with General William Westmoreland, had spent a great deal of time in the months prior telling Americans that the war was nearly over, and that as General Westmoreland told the American people that we were at the point, quote, where the end begins to come into view, unquote. So when Americans saw the U.S. Embassy in Saigon under attack and civilian personnel engaged in shootouts around the embassy grounds, when they witnessed the grueling battles for the ancient city of Hue on the nightly news, or when they saw the images of a Viet Cong guerrilla dragged into a Saigon street and executed at point-blank range by a South Vietnamese general, they were shocked. Even Walter Cronkite, the famous reporter, stated that the only conclusion to draw was that the war was a stalemate. Not long after the Tet Offensive and the massive protests that inspired in the United States, President Lyndon Johnson, looking tired and defeated, announced on March 31st that he would not accept the nomination for the presidency from his party. The Democrats, however, were not totally lost. The New Left was a surging voice in American politics, and Bobby Kennedy was an inspiring political candidate that seemed to promise a new and better tomorrow, seemed to promise peace. But his assassination in June of 1968 meant that Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, would ultimately be the candidate. And the Democratic Party inevitably struggled to separate the candidate from the disastrous war policy of the president. The Democrats were divided between the progressive, anti-war New Left and the centrist core of the party. And the Johnson administration would remain the focus at the Democratic Convention held in Chicago, Illinois. When the convention came to Chicago, a massive protest ensued near the convention center. Largely due to the policy of Democrat Mayor Richard Daley, the police suppressed the protest to the point that historians consider it a police riot. The convention was chaos, inside the building and outside, and it was all over the news. This was a moment that carried consequences not unlike Herbert Hoover's infamous Battle of Anacostia Flats in 1932. It was almost impossible to imagine a Democratic victory given the optics of what had occurred. Indeed, the Democrats lost, and Nixon and the Republicans won handedly. And in the Deep South, signifying an anti-statist shift away from the old Southern Democrats, and a reaction to the unpopularity of civil rights legislation in the Deep South. 5 states voted for pro-segregationist presidential candidate George Wallace. The Johnson presidency was over. Johnson's term of office was full of contradictions and irony. On the one hand, LBJ was one of the most politically savvy leaders in American history, the epitome of the politician that knew how to get others to vote his way. But on the other hand, he, unlike John F. Kennedy, lacked inability to reevaluate, to change his mind. Once he had made a decision, he expected people to follow him loyally. On the one hand, Johnson helped to usher in the most important civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction period, a century prior, and created social reforms rivaled only by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. But on the other hand, he was associated with an atrocity, a failed war policy that was sowing the seeds of protest, death, political distrust, and government overreach. Johnson's Vietnam War was so unpopular among the New Left that Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967 stated that, quote, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military and defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death," unquote. Despite an impressive victory, Nixon, in many respects, carried on where Johnson had left off. He benefited more from a Democratic Party in chaos than an articulated path to a better tomorrow. Nixon rode to the presidency claiming to be a law and order candidate. However, his presidency was to be defined by law-breaking and ignoring of congressional oversight. Indeed, Richard Nixon was unique in his propensity to violate the law while in office, probably a result of the fact that Nixon later admitted that he believed the president was above the law. But Nixon was about 50 years too early on this constitutional interpretation. His behavior as president was probably the single most significant factor in a decline in public trust, building a basis for cynicism that eventually made the Trump versus United States Supreme Court decision not nearly as shocking as it should have been. This, of course, was the 2024 Supreme Court decision that asserted that as long as the president acted in an official capacity, that they could not be held accountable for breaking the law. On Vietnam, Nixon promised peace with honor, and in pursuing this, he continued the Johnson policy of Vietnamization, which was bad for the stability of South Vietnam as much as it was for the American soldiers asked to serve there. Vietnamization was a term that referred to the gradual process of turning the war over to the South Vietnamese. As the conflict turned unpopular in the late 1960s, and it became apparent that the public would only tolerate an American-led war for so long, this approach developed to equip and train the South Vietnamese to take on the security of their own country, and much like Afghanistan half a century later, was a miserable failure. Troop morale in Vietnam declined as soldiers understood themselves as serving in a conflict that the government was no longer fully committed to. The South Vietnamese government, at no point since the creation of the country in the years following the conclusion of the French Indochina War, had demonstrated an ability to exist without significant support from the United States. Vietnamization was a death knell for South Vietnam. However, Nixon did not believe this at the time, and he would take steps that he hoped would ensure the stability of South Vietnam and a peace agreement that could extricate Americans and give some chance of survival to the South. Instead, Nixon's policies ushered in perhaps the most controversial moments of the Vietnam War, which, along with the string of illegal actions emanating from Nixon's White House, marked the beginning of a collapse in public trust in government. Nixon's approach to Vietnam, how to achieve peace with honor, was simple. Expand the war. Yes, expand the war. but not by sending in more troops, as was the approach under General William Westmoreland and President Lyndon Johnson, but rather by disregarding certain combat restrictions that had existed prior. To decapitate the Viet Cong guerrillas in 1968, the CIA began the Phoenix program, which was an assassination campaign in the South that was described by witnesses as similar to shooting everyone in a bar or restaurant to kill one person. It did decimate the Viet Cong, though it did not win hearts and minds. To defeat the North Vietnamese, Nixon ordered invasions of Cambodia and Laos, which were major infiltration points into South Vietnam from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And he would bomb the North in a more intense and less regulated fashion. The idea with the bombing campaign under Johnson, Operation Rolling Thunder, was to demonstrate the power of the United States and force the North to negotiate, to find their breaking point. However, to avoid conflict with the Soviet Union, as well as excessive international criticism, the campaign was limited to specific targets, and no bombing in significant areas of the North and or around population zones like Hanoi and Haiphong was permitted. Nixon continued much of this approach, but relaxed the limitations on where bombers could target in the North. And as a result, Nixon's bombing campaigns, Linebacker 1 and 2, resulted in far more extensive bombing in urban areas. Of course, none of Nixon's escalation in Vietnam worked. After invading Cambodia, mass protests ensued across the United States, particularly on college campuses, and 4 students were shot and killed by the National Guard at Kent State University. Police shot and killed 2 others at Jackson State University in Mississippi. The operations into Cambodia and Laos netted no meaningful strategic result either. In 1972, an extensive bombing around the North Vietnamese capital of Hanoi, known as the Christmas bombing, which was intended to force the North into concessions at the negotiating table, resulted in the January signing of the Paris Peace Accords. But this agreement was effectively identical to the one that the North would have signed prior to the bombing. And the North was allowed to remain in occupied regions all across South Vietnam. Nixon promised to bomb in support of the South Vietnamese government. But politically, of course, things would change in 1973 and 1974 that would make this impossible. In 1975, the North Vietnamese army overran South Vietnam with shocking speed, and to the great humiliation of the United States, which was caught off guard. The United States had lost the war, and in as shocking and humiliating fashion as is possible. Had all those lives been lost in vain? A precipitous decline in trust in government began to unfold. Of course, also highly significant to the decline in public trust in government was the inherently corrupt presidency of Richard Nixon. Ironically, in 1972, Nixon was a very popular president with 62% approval, according to Gallup polling. In November, when he won the presidential election over George McGovern in one of the most impressive landslides in election history, McGovern received a mere 17 electoral votes. Of course, this was also the moment that was among the most consequential with respects to public trust in government, because Watergate hung in the background, unseen, of the 1972 presidential election. And 2 years later, Nixon's approval rating was only 24%, which remains the lowest end-of-office number at any point since the Cold War began. If you were to ask American citizens if they believe that the founders of the country felt that the president was above the law or had a right to break the law while in office, we should feel very confident that few would believe this to be so. Nixon believed it to be so. In ways, so too did the Supreme Court in Trump versus the United States in 2024, at least if it were in a, quote, official capacity. Undoubtedly, the American people nor the Republican Party agreed with this in the 1970s. And it was for this reason that the Watergate revelations carried crushing ramifications for public trust in government. Richard Nixon would resign his presidency largely at the pressure of his own party in 1974, as the tapes that Nixon had recorded increasingly revealed that Nixon was directly responsible for illegal break-ins and an attempted cover-up. According to Pew Research data, public trust in government, which was declining in the 1960s, largely stabilized during Nixon's first term, holding consistently in the mid-50% range. It dipped a bit, but it held in the mid-50% range. Between 1972 and 1974, it collapsed, falling nearly 20 points from 54% to 36% when Nixon left office in 1974, forced to resign amid pressure from his own party. Of course, 36% is still far above where public trust is 2 decades into the 21st century. So there still remains much more to this story than just Vietnam and Watergate. But Watergate was devastating. The President of the United States was directing employees to conduct break-ins. They broke into Daniel Ellsberg's doctor's office, hoping to find information to smear the leaker of the Pentagon Papers. They broke into the Democratic headquarters to plant listening devices to spy on the Democrat campaign, getting caught in their second break-in. Nixon had directed it all. There were also allegations of campaign finance violations. His vice president, Spiro Agnew, had already resigned amid a financial scandal, and Nixon, too, faced significant questions. For both Johnson and Nixon, the two presidential legacies were not entirely negative. Indeed, both did things that are among the most positive, important steps that modern executive branches have taken. Among other accomplishments, Johnson's Great Society remains perhaps the most effective measure to combat poverty and to provide Americans with health care, rivaled only by the New Deal. Johnson, in fact, envisioned his Great Society to be far more than it actually was, but it was hampered ultimately by the excessive spending and hesitation to raise tax cuts to pay for the costly Vietnam War. Johnson, too, was associated with important steps on civil rights and other areas, like agreements with the Soviet Union to not militarize space. Nixon carried on many of Johnson's domestic reforms and, like in Vietnam, expanded on these. He increased spending for social safety net programs. Nixon supported the Clean Air Act, created the Environmental Protection Agency, and ushered in the Cold War era of détente that brought with it landmark nuclear arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, as well as beginning the process of normalization with China. However, in democratic societies, the social contract hinges on trust more than anything. The people must believe that their elected leaders are representing them honestly and have their best interest at heart. And despite the positive achievements of both Johnson and Nixon, both administrations were caught in blatant violations of trust, and this dishonesty represented a betrayal of the social contract, and Americans responded to it. Needless to say, when Gerald Ford, the United States' only unelected president, took office, he had a significant problem with public trust in government on his hands. Next time on the History Changes podcast, we will examine the 1970s to the Reagan Revolution. Was this a possible renaissance for democracy and public trust in the 1980s and into the 1990s? Join me next time here on History Changes for our next episode of Breaking the Social Contract. I'm Dr. Philip W. Travis. Thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, and follow if you enjoy this. And stay tuned for the next episode in about 2 weeks.